I have the pleasure of welcoming our keynote speaker, Natalie Warren. In addition to being a lifelong paddler and river lover, Natalie Warren is an author, writer, and scholar. She was one of the first two women to paddle the 2,000-mile route from Minneapolis to Hudson Bay. Yeah, give her a round of applause for that. I'm tired thinking about it. Natalie has since canoed the length of the Mississippi River and won first place for the Yukon River Quest in the Women's Voyager Division, paddling 450 miles in 53 hours. Yeah, another round of applause, yes. A contributing writer to outdoor publications, she has worked with Bancroft Arneson Explore, Wild Rivers Conservancy, and River Management Society. She started a nonprofit to present urban rivers as natural, dynamic classrooms for youth. She is currently a doctoral candidate researching environmental communication at the University of Minnesota, where she studies the human-nature relationship and works with the publication, Open Rivers, Rethinking Water, Place, and Community. I will also say Natalie, after her presentation, she will be selling books, her books, and so she will also entertain any questions that you all have when she is selling her books, and she will be selling her books at the registration desk. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Natalie to the stage.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm actually going to kick things off by playing a song. Music has been an integral part to all of the canoe expeditions that I've been on over the years, and so I'd like to set the stage with Across the Great Divide is the name of the song. I've been walking in my sleep. I've been counting troubles instead of counting sheep. And where the years went, I just can't say. I just turn around and they've gone away. And I've been sifting through the layers of dusty books and faded papers. They tell a story that I used to know, one that happened so long ago, and it's gone away. And yesterday, now I find myself on the mountainside, where the rivers change direction across the Great Divide. Now I heard the owl calling so softly as the night was falling. She asked a question and I replied, but she's gone now across the borderline, and it's gone away. And yesterday, across the great divide, the finest hour that I have seen. It is the one that comes between the edge of night and the break of day. It's when that darkness, it rolls away, and it's gone away. And yesterday, now I find myself on the mountainside, where the rivers change direction across the great divide. Thanks. So, disclaimer, I'm pregnant and I'm already out of breath. So thanks for bearing with me. I'm gonna kick things off by reading part of the prologue of my book. Sometimes a great adventure lands in your lap. That's exactly what happened on a chilly February day in my dorm room at St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. Anne flung open the door of my room with fire in her eyes and a book in her hand. I had been cooped up all day writing a paper. The interruption, although abrupt, was a welcome break to a gloomy and uneventful day. She lingered in the doorway with a familiar smirk on her face. "Yes, Anne? How can I help you this fine evening?" I asked facetiously. We'd been scheming trips together for 4 years, and it seemed every adventure started with Anne standing in the doorway with that same expression. She threw the book at me from across the room. "Read this," she said. "We should do it." I looked down at the book, Canoeing with the Cree, now lying on the bed in front of me. There was a silhouette of 2 people paddling a canoe on the cover. I looked back up to respond, but Anne was gone. The monotony of the day was getting to me. I needed a break. Reading a chapter or 2 would provide a welcome respite from schoolwork. But after the first few chapters, I just kept going, flying through the story of 2 men, Eric Severide and Walter Seaport, who in 1930 paddled from Minneapolis to Hudson Bay. They were fresh out of high school and didn't have sleeping bags or maps for the long journey. Their story was documented by the Minneapolis Star, and their adventurous spirit brought them to the shores of Hudson Bay, inspiring supporters and skeptics across the country. Severide and Port traveled through agricultural rivers and wild waters of the North. I began wondering what those rivers looked like today. If we decided to make the trip, would we too get lost on Mud Lake near the headwaters of the Minnesota River and be hopelessly windbound on Lake Winnipeg? Hours passed as I continued reading, furiously flipping pages about the Native community at Norway House and how Eric and Walter went to church at York Factory on the shores of Hudson Bay. Meanwhile, the gray sky outside my window had turned to black. The cafeteria was long closed by now, so I shoved a granola bar into my mouth and finished the last few pages of the book by headlamp. I closed the book and shut my eyes. Yes, I want to do this trip, I thought. Why not? Everyone around me was frantically applying for jobs, and very few people were hearing back from prospective employers. What else was I going to do after graduation? I wanted something more than the seemingly predictable life path in front of me. I felt an itch to do something crazy. An energy inside me was overflowing, yearning to get out and get going, and no internship or entry-level job could fulfill my desire to live and breathe and feel the earth around me. The next day, I threw the book back at Anne and said, "I'm in." What I didn't know was just what I was signing up for, or how it would profoundly change my perceptions of everything around me. My city upbringing and higher education did not prepare me to unbiasedly interact with people who were different from myself. Yet on this expedition, I would be forced into uncomfortable situations with people from a variety of backgrounds, especially political, and would slowly begin to witness the complex web of humanity. This is the story of how Anne Reho and I became the first two women to recreate Eric Sevareid and Walter Port's route to Hudson Bay, a route that has been attempted and sometimes completed many times since it was popularized in 1930. It is also an account of the present-day condition of the lakes and rivers between the Twin Cities and Hudson Bay, the people who live on these waters and the communities that shape them. It explores the intrinsic connection that human beings have to moving water and reflects on the raw challenges we faced as two women making history. So let's rewind real quick. This is me in high school. Thank you. I was born and raised in the concrete jungle of Miami, Florida. I did not grow up camping or canoeing, and I went to high school in downtown Miami, an art school for saxophone performance. All I did all day was play the saxophone at the age of 15, and I got really burnt out and started to think I should really figure out what other things I like to do. A friend told me about a place in northern Minnesota called the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, which you may be familiar with. If you're not, it's a beautiful wilderness area north of here. And I'm the youngest of 3 children, and so I really liked doing dramatic things. I marched home that day and I told my mother I was gonna go canoeing in Minnesota that summer. And Minnesota was sort of in this gray blob in the middle of the country. Growing up in Miami, you have like the major cities on the coast and then this area that I didn't know much about. My mother agreed, and so I hopped on a plane, took a bus up to the North Shore, and I went on a 2-week canoe trip with YMCA Camp Minojan. There were 7 girls total on this trip, and there were a lot of cultural differences. We spent a lot of time talking about the difference between pop and soda and bagels and bagels. One night I woke up to the sound of wolves howling, and I was legitimately concerned we were going to be eaten alive. And so I woke everyone up and I said, "The wolves are coming." And they paused and listened and they started laughing. And they said, "Oh, that's the call of the loon, not the howl of the wolf." So I had a lot to learn quickly. My mother even wrote me a note that I opened on trail. "Beautiful, tear-stained, I'm so proud of you and the risks that you take." And then it said, "I hope you enjoy the beautiful mountains of Minnesota." And I'm like, literally no one knows where I am. But I continued to go on trips every summer, always looking forward to it throughout the school year. I had found my stride in hiking boots and with a Swiss Army knife, and a sense of confidence that I had not previously discovered as a teenage girl. That next summer, I went on a 30-day canoe trip in Ontario in Wabakimi Provincial Park. And the summer after that, the summer before college, I went on a 50-day canoe trip in Nunavut, Canada, paddling the Inuit heritage rivers, the Kazan and Kunwak in the tundra. This trip was a dream I wish, honestly, would last forever. It's still one of my favorite trips, but perhaps more magical than the thousands of migrating caribou we could see across the tundra, or the musk oxen lazily grazing by the river, was the woman who was assigned to be my paddling partner. This is Anne Reho. Anne Reho grew up frolicking in the woods in Minnesota. She, in many ways, was this badass outdoor woman I so badly was wanting to be at this stage in life. And we were just making small talk the first day in the canoe, and I said, "Well, where are you going to college in the fall?" And she said, "St. Olaf." And I said, "No way, me too." And we ended up in the same freshman dorm. So for 4 years, we schemed. Whenever life got hard, relationships, family, anything, we would end up in each other's dorm rooms, poring over maps, always asking, Where should we go next? What should we do next? And that brings us up to the prologue. We were often asked why it was important to be the first 2 women to recreate this historic route. My first thought, and Anne's too, was that we were surprised no 2 women had done it before. We didn't possess superpowers beyond other paddlers, and Anne had simply struck gold finding a beloved canoe route to recreate that women hadn't done yet, and I was smart enough to say yes. Honestly, at that time, I didn't understand how sexist our society was when I was 22. The more I've experienced what it means to be a woman as an adult, the more impressed I am with what we did. I didn't expect to encounter such direct sexism beyond the subtle interactions that all women face when trying to do anything out of the ordinary. But naysayers fanned a fire in us to prove that we could be the first 2 women to paddle this route. I talk about a guy in the book who laughed at us when we told him where we were going. He said we wouldn't make it to Hudson Bay until October if we made it at all. He even promised to send us a keg of beer if we actually finished. When we got there in August, he was the first person we called, and he didn't remember who we were. We thought about him every day. We also received responses from sponsorship requests saying, "Who cares that you're the first 2 women to do this? Women have had the right to vote for decades now." As if we lived in a post-sexist society. I was nervous to do this trip in the first place because of the looming story that if we make one wrong step in life, then we might mess up everything. That somehow we need to constantly orient ourselves toward the things that we think we want, or else we may never get them. Women especially are constantly reminded and encouraged to achieve socially acceptable life milestones: college, internships, job, marriage, house, kids, better job, bigger house, retirement. But a lot of us sit back and wonder, what if that is not what we want? Patriarchal cultural norms felt cold, rigid, and unfulfilling to us. Anne and I both felt frustrated with the life path we were told we were supposed to have. We wanted to break out of that and do something different with our lives, to breathe fresh air, drink clean water, and just worry about what to eat and where to camp. 2 women going canoeing for 3 months tells an alternative narrative to life, one that is not heard enough, and one that I'm thrilled to share through my book. Here is a map of our route. I know, did anyone do the Bidote tour or go to the Minnesota Valley Wildlife Refuge? Awesome, so that's where we started. Very cool, and we went upstream on the Minnesota River, downstream on the Red River, up the east shore of Lake Winnipeg, and then we took a series of rivers, mostly the Hayes River, out to York Factory on Hudson Bay. But this expedition is more than a fun adventure that we took a decade ago now. Paddling this route, Anne and I flowed through Indigenous and settler colonial history, scars and current struggles, invisible political boundaries, multiple ontologies of the people on the waterways, and the physical connectivity of the land, water, and air. We launched from Fort Snelling State Park, near Pike Island, where the Minnesota River flows into the Mississippi River. Here's a video of our launch. This confluence is known as Bidote, the center of the universe to the Dakota people. The first leg of our trip was paddling upstream during a flood for 330 miles through Dakota land on the Minnesota River, through what is today considered America's Corn Belt. We joked that if we got swept downstream, we would paddle the Mississippi River instead, but we were able to move at a steady 1.5 miles an hour. You can walk the Minnesota River faster than we paddled it, but we got to appreciate every leaf on every tree. Y'all like trees, right? Before we left on our trip, people told us the Minnesota River is a polluted agricultural river. It's the river of chocolate milk. It's too bad you have to paddle it as a part of this route. Our expectations were extremely low. But on our first day, we were paddling through a national wildlife refuge. Otters came up to swim by our boat, wishing us good luck on our journey, a sign of fairly good ecosystem health. We found the Minnesota River to be a beautiful, underrated recreational gem, and it felt like we had it all to ourselves. Yet, the Minnesota River is also a polluted agricultural river. I studied environmental studies and policy in college, and so, of course, because I had thought about and talked about and read about issues in a silo for 4 years, I thought I knew what I was talking about. And then I was launched into the world quite literally. I noticed that a lot of the corn and soybean farms that we were passing did not have buffer zones, areas of vegetation in between where the crops end and the river begins that helps filter out a lot of the chemicals that we're using on these conventional fields. Instead, what we saw was that the river was going directly over a lot of those fields, which means that those chemicals are going into the Minnesota River, flowing into the Mississippi River, flowing into the Gulf of Mexico, and that excess nitrogen is contributing to the dead zone in which those algal blooms deplete oxygen and don't allow for aquatic life to thrive. Anne and I were experiencing the very beginning of a global food and water crisis in which the way that we grow food directly pollutes our water resources. But because the river was flooded, we couldn't find dry land to camp on, and so we were knocking on farmers' doors, asking if we could camp on their crops. Next thing you know, they invited us over for dinner, and at a young age, we were having very candid conversations with people with different lived experiences than our own. We asked them, why do you grow all the way to the river? Don't you know it's harming the water quality? And they said, yeah, but we get paid based on yield. And to survive in this industry, we have to grow as much as possible. And so slowly we began to witness the contradictions, tensions, and the complexities of agricultural issues and social issues along the river. We would pass these drainage pipes. So this area used to have over 18 million acres of prairie and wetland, now which only less than 1% remains as we've tilled the land for farming. Which means when the rain used to fall, it would hit the ground, seep into the soil, recharge the groundwater system, maybe meander to a stream or river. Today, when that rain falls, it hits the ground and gets shot out to the river like a high-speed train. And as a result, there's more river than has been historically in the Minnesota River, more water flowing. And as it rushes downstream, it eats away at the banks and erodes the land and doesn't allow for vegetation to grow. This sediment flows with the water all the way into the Mississippi River and doesn't have a chance to settle until it gets to Lake Pepin on the Mississippi, which is slowly filling in. Anne and I had been on several wilderness trips before, and on those trips, you sing a song and you write a poem and you enjoy the scenic beauty in each other's company. But this trip was really different. We were paddling in areas where we could look directly at human impact on the landscape, things that are often hidden intentionally from human eyes, things like this energy plant in which we could observe and move slowly by it. We could feel the change in water temperature before and after the plant and start to speculate on the impact that that has on the aquatic ecosystem. Paddling upstream is very challenging, but it's especially challenging when you're paddling upstream towards a dam because the water is very fast. And this is a picture of us paddling upstream towards the Granite Falls Dam. You can see the water hitting the bow of our canoe. I looked over at a tree as we were paddling and it wasn't moving. And so I realized that we were not moving and we were just on this river treadmill. And in between deep breaths, Anne and I decided, let's just pull over and we'll portage or carry all of our gear to the other side of the dam and we'll put back in. But after we agreed to do this, 2 photographers from the local paper jump out of the bushes and they start taking our picture and going, you can do it. You can paddle all the way to the dam. And so, of course, a nonverbal agreement and sense of pride, and we continue paddling. And it took us about 45 minutes to go less than half a mile. But meanwhile, the whole community of Granite Falls trickled to the riverbank to cheer us on. When we finally got to the takeout, we get out, the mayor comes to greet us. He enthusiastically shakes our hand and says, wow, I've never even seen 2 guys do that before. I'm like, why would anyone do that? We continued through the headwaters of the Minnesota River through the divide, on to the Bois de Sioux River, which meets up with the Otter Tail in Wahpeton, the Red River of the North. Finally, we were living the dream downstream, now paddling. If we were going 12 to 15 miles a day on the Minnesota River, we were now paddling 50 to 60 miles a day on the flooded Red River, paddling sometimes straight over cornfields to cut corners as the corn slowly bent with the current beneath our canoe. We came across this monument to represent the disappearance of the family farm. You used to need a whole community to run and manage a farm, at least an entire family. Now, with the advancements in agricultural technology, you can feasibly have 1 or 2 people farming thousands of acres of land, and they don't even necessarily own the land or live on the land. Anne and I noticed as we stopped in small towns, people would show us around and they would say, this place used to be really cool. But now a lot of these small areas are experiencing dwindling populations as younger generations are not returning to take over the family farm. We met old men getting older alone on their farms with no one to take over their fields. But I don't want to paint this doom and gloom picture of the Red River and the Minnesota River. There are some really amazing things happening here as well. There was a vibrancy in the people we met too, a sense of community and place that would bring any urbanite to their knees. We met a woman on the trip who was so excited to show us her favorite tree, and it nearly made me cry because I wanted so badly someday to be in one place long enough to also have a favorite tree. Anne and I would often talk about the potential of these rivers and the joy of paddling from town to town on the water trail. We would daydream of the resurgence of small town America with a focus on community, clean water, good food, and recreation. We had to cross the border into Canada on the Red River. And Anne is far more organized and better at logistics than I am. And so she had reached out to the border station beforehand and told them what we were doing. And they agreed to meet us by the river so that we wouldn't have to carry all of our gear to the border station and back, which would have taken the entire day. But that being said, we still had no idea what to expect. And so we took off like any other morning on the river, and we turn a corner and we see a bridge with 2 huge black SUVs on top. And when they see us, they turn their sirens on and they come down to the river. The Red River is a muddy, mucky river, especially when it's flooded. And so you can't just simply canoe to solid ground and start walking. And so as 6 border agents line up in really shiny black shoes and full uniform, just waiting for us to come to them, they're watching this performance unfold before them, in which we get stuck in the mud, and then we step out and we have to quick feet so we don't sink into the mud. And finally, we get the boat as close as we can. We slop over to them and they look at us and they look at their clean boots and the boat and they're like, we're not gonna go over there. So why don't you just bring your gun? We brought a gun with us for extra protection in polar bear country, and we'll take you to the station to sign a waiver. Anne went to the station with 3 border agents, and it took her forever while I'm trying to make small talk with these 3 on shore. And I'm pretty socially capable, but after dead end question after dead end question, we were just standing in silence for about 45 minutes. Finally, Anne comes back. She gets really nervous and heats up easily and was turning bright red, and so they accused her of acting suspiciously and had to ask her a series of questions, but finally we were able to push off into Canada. We decided after the adrenaline of crossing the border that we would paddle 100 miles straight overnight to Winnipeg. We were excited to get to the city of Winnipeg because Anne's parents were meeting us there for our second food drop, and we knew we were gonna stay at a hotel. Very excited about that. I also had spent 2 weeks slowly convincing Anne that we should see the premiere of Harry Potter when we were there, and we were the smelliest people in the movie theater. I'll never forget being able to smell people's deodorant. It was very pungent. You all smell great. This is the moon around 1 a.m. during our overnight paddle. We had about a 2-hour repertoire of music that we would sing every day, and we were starting to get really tired, so we were singing as loud as we could to stay awake. we were singing Cat Stevens' Moon Shadow, but we only knew one verse, so we would just repeat it over and over and over and over again until we would move on. But we really liked the idea that as we were paddling through a suburban area south of Winnipeg, that people had their windows open in the summer and could hear river sirens through the night. This was July, and so the sun came out around 4 a.m., and we paddled into this beautiful sunrise. At this point, we can calculate, we haven't slept in 24 hours, but we'll be in the city limits of Winnipeg by 7 a.m. What could go wrong? Well, 7 a.m. rolls around, and there's just this big sign pointing towards the river that says, danger. Nothing else, nothing helpful, just danger. And our different personalities shine. I'm like, funny sign, and I keep paddling. And Anne's like, no, this is meant for us. And so we pull over, and Anne, makes her way over to the sign, looking for a phone number anywhere, doesn't find one. And she comes back defeated, and she's like, let's just go. And we turn the corner, and we're now facing this massive infrastructure, dam, control tower on top, rushing white water. They had opened the floodgates around the city of Winnipeg to help manage the flood. So then we had to triple portage over a bunch of boulders and a street to get to the other side of this structure. The third time over, this guy comes out of the control tower with a cup of coffee, looking real leisurely. And we're not in the best mood. And he's like, where are you going? And we're like, we're going to Hudson Bay. He's like, oh, okay. And we walk away. And Anne just stops and turns around and just starts yelling at him to put a phone number on the sign while I'm dragging her down saying, thanks for letting us portage your dam. But after paddling through eroded riverbank for so long, land that so clearly was yearning for something different, it seemed ridiculous to us that instead of restoring the floodplains and prairies, these natural systems with the ability to alleviate negative impacts of flooding, it was decided instead to put billions of dollars towards forcefully rerouting the river around the city. A decision that perpetuates human mastery over the landscape instead of working in reciprocal relationship with the land and water to restore balance. Something we would experience over and over again on our trip. We finally made it to Winnipeg. You can see in this picture, it's still very flooded. This is near where the Assiniboine River flows into the Red River. We did get to see Harry Potter. We did get to stay in a hotel, but then we pushed off on the next leg of our journey. Lake Winnipeg, 280 miles up the east shore. Lake Winnipeg is the 11th largest lake in the world in terms of surface area. It's a very shallow lake, which means when the wind blows, the waves pick up very quickly and it becomes dangerous to paddle. People told us not to paddle Lake Winnipeg. We heard a lot of horror stories before we left, but we decided that we would give it a try and stay as close to shore as possible. We were nervous to reach this part of our trip. But when we got to Lake Winnipeg, it was glass. The blue of the water reached into the horizon to where you couldn't tell where the water ended and the sky began. But of course, that was not meant to last. It took us 18 days to paddle the lake, 7 of those days in which we were windbound, unable to paddle due to the waves and the weather. We were reaching a more isolated part of our journey. We were running into fewer and fewer people, and we were experiencing the scenic beauty, things like watching the sun set into itself across the horizon. Anne and I were together for about 100 days straight. And there's something beautiful and terrifying about traversing the world in a tandem canoe. The structure of the canoe itself requires 2 people to become one entity. The positioning of the paddlers tasked with different responsibilities, one concerned with direction and the other with speed, puts the canoers in verbal and nonverbal conversation with each other. It's a delicate dance of power, judgment, and control. It's a place where our histories and identities emerge and collide through the simple sway of the bow. So we got along really well for most of this trip, but we definitely had our issues. To sum it up, I was a little more carefree, and Anne, I thought, was a little bit too anxious. This actually makes for a really great expedition team, but balance is the key. And we had become unbalanced. We were paddling at night, and we push off on this flat lake in which the stars in the Milky Way are reflecting on the lake. So it looked like we were paddling through space. And I was in the stern directing where the canoe would go. And I was like, we're going to take advantage of this chill night and we're going to go as far across as we can. And Anne asked me to point closer to shore. And I thought I had, but a simple sway of the bow back to the middle of the lake made us snap. We started yelling at each other. Things that happened back in college, all the way up through the trip. We were pulling the weeds of our relationship and airing it all out. We hadn't even fought yet on this trip, and here we were screaming at each other. Unbeknownst to us during that time, a green orb started to glow in the sky above us. We reached a point where our issues were unresolved and we were not talking to each other, but we were watching the northern lights dance and expand above us. I wanted so badly to tell Anne this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, but I wasn't talking to her. And the only thing that we said to each other that night, I thought I was now overcompensating, getting too close to shore. And so I said, can you shine your headlamp and see how far away the shore is? And she did. And there were two huge green eyes of a bull moose staring back at us, not 100 yards away. And she said, yep, we're too close to shore. The next morning, we were windbound. We were still not talking to each other. And I wrote a letter to Anne, which is documented in the book, but essentially said that we are sisters, and like sisters, we fight. And conflict actually strengthens relationships in many ways. From then on, our relationship only improved day by day. In the North Basin of Lake Winnipeg, it's hard to see in this picture, but we encountered a green, slimy carpet of algal blooms floating just below the surface of the water. Algal blooms caused by the nutrient runoff from agriculture on the Red River. To paddle the entire Red River and to see those lands and then to paddle over the aftermath of those chemicals was very impactful for us as we began to grieve and mourn what we have done to the landscape. These algal blooms are so large that you can see them with the naked eye from space and have a huge impact on the fishing industry and the small towns on Lake Winnipeg. We finally finished paddling the lake. We didn't cry when we made it to Hudson Bay, spoiler, but we did bawl when we finished Lake Winnipeg because we knew that at this point we could feasibly make it all the way. We hopped onto the Nelson River, which would connect us to the Echimamish River and then eventually the Hayes River. We were taken in like family by the Mushwagans at Norway House Cree First Nation, and we got there just in time for York Boat Days, in which the community races these large boats that the Hudson Bay Company would use for trading. The winner of the race gets $10,000, and this is a community in which 85% of people are on welfare. There's a lot of hype around winning this race. There were people out playing music and cooking food, dogs running around. It was very vibrant. And we noticed everyone was lining up in the middle of town in the afternoon, and we asked Mike Mushwagan, who we were staying with, what's going on? Like, what's the next event? And he said, actually, this event was created by the Canadian government to celebrate the day that our lands were stolen. And every year we line up and receive an annual $5 from the government as reparations for generations of injustice and stolen land. We were faced with the sobering reality that when people are forcefully taken from their land, they're also stripped of a future in which they are not constantly fighting for rights and recognition. We stayed up late with Mike and Janice and their family talking about more issues at Norway House, but also the hope that they have, the young people who are coming back, the resurgence and the energy to fight for their lands. Stories of Native American resilience and their durable connections to the land, water, and each other show us a path to the future and a different way of living together in this place that we share. Mike also was telling us that they had a stray dog problem, which we had noticed. And he just looks at us kind of funny and is like, well, y'all are going into polar bear country. You should take a dog with you. And then if a polar bear comes, it'll eat your dog and you'll have time to load your gun. And, we kind of laughed this off, but then the next day we're just sort of window shopping at all the stray dogs. And Mike's daughter drove us around that night as we were looking for a dog about this big to put in our canoe. I saw the silhouette of a dog licking ketchup packets off the floor outside their movie theater, and I knew she was the one. So I ran out of the car and I grabbed her, and this is Mai-han. Mai-he-han in Cree means wolf, and we liked to think that she was part wolf, and Mike and Janice blessed us with that name. We put her in the canoe the next morning, and it turns out she's afraid of water. This actually works out really well. If you've ever canoed with a dog who loves water, it's quite challenging. So she just sort of slept in the boat most of the day, somehow always found the highest point of our canoe when we were running rapid sets. But she would run around and hunt at night. One morning, we got out of our tent to discover she had brought us a beaver hand. So we decided that she liked us, and we in no way saw her as live bait, but a new member of our expedition team. We continued on to the Hayes River, the Arctic Hayes River, a beautiful scenic place, in many ways the place we had been traveling to this entire time as we were paddling whitewater sets together as a team. Paddling to Hudson Bay showed me that what we do on land greatly impacts the water. Water quality usually does not collapse overnight. It degrades slowly as a result of small compromises and seemingly harmless encroachments of industry and development sprinkled across a watershed. On this expedition, we witnessed the water change from polluted agricultural rivers, where we had to fill large water jugs until the next resupply, to the beautiful, clean Arctic waters of the Hayes River, where we had the rare privilege of drinking water directly from the river without filtering. The Hayes River, unlike other sections of our expedition, is relatively untouched by humans. It has room to breathe, sink into the ground, expand into the landscape. It effortlessly provided us with fresh water and abundant fish to eat. This pristine waterway reminded us of what rivers once were, of what we have already lost, and of what could come back with new ways of living in and with the world. We finally made it to York Factory on Hudson Bay, and I felt a deep emptiness when we arrived. There was no party or trophy at the end, just a set of stairs leading up to a building that once manufactured York boats. We had the rare privilege of seeing a polar bear in the wild before we took to the skies and began the long journey back to Minnesota. We then spent 2 weeks at Anne's cabin in northern Minnesota, slowly transitioning back into society, sitting on her front porch, looking out at a lake that once seemed so large, now seemed so small. This expedition was a coming-of-age journey that became so much more than just two strong women exploring the wilderness. The scars on the landscape unfolded before our eyes as we paddled north. The harm done by industry and agriculture and the injustices done to First Nation communities were impossible to ignore as we moved with the land and water. I can still feel those visceral moments of standing in a cornfield and being in a food desert, meeting farmers who could barely feed themselves, of paddling over toxic algal blooms on Lake Winnipeg caused by agricultural runoff, and watching a First Nation community line up to receive their annual $5 from the government as compensation for stolen land. We mourned what we have done to the earth and to each other as we paddled north. Yet Robin Wall Kimmerer reminds us of the importance of grief and mourning, saying, if grief can be a doorway to love, then let us all weep for the world we are breaking apart so we can love it back to wholeness again. To experience the world is to look directly at those scars that we have made, to unveil normalized harm and rebuild and repair those relationships severed by colonialism. When we slow down, walk through the forest, or even through our own neighborhoods, we might just open ourselves to imagine different ways of living, ones that work with the earth instead of against it. Methodically moving with a landscape teaches us to slow down, to look again, to observe, digest, and rethink our relationships with the world. Time, memory, history, evolving ideologies, and glimpses of a more resilient path live together in the water and the forest. As we are urgently called to action to build a sustainable future in an era marked by human-caused climate change, moving with a landscape, deeply listening to and loving our surroundings teaches us the importance of thoughtful action so that we might pause and prioritize what the world needs from us instead of just what we need from the world. Good science and policy are vital to this cause, but so is our own relationship to the places we are trying to protect. Sometimes we need reminding that it is okay and almost necessary to slow down and experience the world around us, to break our routines and have the courage to be shaped and reshaped by our encounters with the landscape and with each other. It is almost always easier to stay home. But this poem by Robert Bly helps me to remember to get out the door. What? You want to live your life over again? Well, I suppose, yes. That time in Grand Rapids, my life as I lived it was a series of shynesses. Being bolder, what good would that do? I'd open my door again. I felt abashed, you see. Now I'd go out and say, all right, I'll go with you to Alaska. Just opening the door from inside would have altered me a little. I'm too shy. And so a bolder life is what you want? We could begin now. Just walk with me down to the river. I'll pretend this boat is my life. I'll climb in. Thank you.